somewhat of an experiment. I think I've been keynoting at this conference now for over 15 years, which is probably an all-time record. And kind of like you start to run out of options after that length of time. So we thought we'd aim for a conversation. And given that I've unjustly been given a reputation for cynicism, I thought I'd bring along two people who will make me look completely reasonable by comparison. All right? So this is part of restoring my reputation at that point. One of the ideas here is to say that there's a huge amount of flux going on in the world at the moment. You can actually see the number of new movements, the number of new ideas, the huge switch from big data to Internet of Things, which we'll talk about later, which is much more significant than people are currently going for. We're at a period of massive flux. And there are some big ideas around. Knowledge management has always been a big idea, but to be quite honest, these days is mostly information management. That really hasn't changed in 2 decades, and we've really got to do something about that. We got the whole Agile movement in software development, which we're going to talk about. Design thinking is becoming a fad at the moment, and we're going to express some concerns about that. And complexity theory is probably the next really big paradigm after systems thinking. Systems thinking came in the 80s, it transformed business. Complexity is doing the same sort of thing at the moment. So our plan is to split this into roughly 3 sections. Yeah, in the first section, one of us will outline each of those 3 movements, all right? So basically, Will is going to do design thinking, Jabe, Agile, and I'll do complexity. And that will be a sort of where it is, what it's about, 10-minute overview. Then we're going to have a conversation about what's right and wrong about it at the moment. Some of the ways that things have been industrialized, that should be industrialized. Some of the way that we're getting management fads, all that sort of stuff. Then for the final 15 minutes or so, we'll start to focus on futures and focuses. And throughout that, we're really going to try and challenge some of the conventional concepts of knowledge. I think all of us argue that knowledge exists more, and I'll quote unquote, in the gaps between things, rather than the things themselves. It's in social processes and interaction that knowledge exists, which is one of the reasons why attempts to codify have largely failed, because you can't codify a social process. That's virtually impossible. Yeah? So you'll see us bring some of the theory and practice behind that. We're probably going to have a competition as to who can resist mentioning Deleuze for longest, so we'll try and restrain that, all right? That's been building up in the tweet stream in advance. Right? I also need to apologize because I have to get a plane immediately after this, so at 9:45, that bag is going to get picked up and I'm going to whisk out with apologies to the next keynote. Yeah? Okay, but these guys will pick it up afterwards, right? Yeah, cool.
And then we'll trash everything that you had said.
Yeah, that's all right, yeah. No, you can't, because there'll be a keynote on by that time, so I'm staying while we get in the conversation. So that's the plan, all right? If anybody is really desperate to ask a question, interrupt, but generally the pattern is that doesn't happen. So consider this, you're going to overhear a conversation, but we'll probably be slightly politer than we are when we normally have conversations, because we're aware of the audience, right? So I'd like to start off with Agile, so Jade.
Sure. So I guess, a couple things about Agile. First, it's definitely, a software engineering methodology or idea. I would be remiss in not saying that many of the people who wrote the Agile Manifesto, which it defines what Agile is, would object to using Agile outside of software engineering. There's some reasons for that that I'll get into. First, Agile kind of revolves around this very peculiar paradox, which is this idea that a customer doesn't know what they want until they actually see the thing, and then they might know whether they want it or not. So it's a specific form of kind of empiricism where you have to show something to somebody and have them react to it. The result of this is really a strong objection to a lot of traditional ways of thinking about developing products, in particular a resistance of process, tools, documentation, contracts, and plans. For the people who kind of think of Agile or thought of Agile, they look at all of those things as being blockers to action. They look at them as slowing down the production of the final product that then they can show to the customer. So if you just start from the idea that the first thing you have to do is show somebody something, actual working software, in order for them to even know whether they want it or not, then you look at all of those other things and you say, oh wait, those are all just slowing us down. They're not allowing us to build the software, right? So this is, a specific form of empiricism and a specific form of thinking about what is important to make. And the result of this is, the Agile Manifesto, is that there's 4 main sections to it, and I'll just go through them really quickly. First of all, instead of focus on process, focus on interactions. In particular, if we can create lightweight processes that are significantly less heavy than when Agile was written, the rational unified process, huge binders full of documents, were popular. If we can avoid that and create lightweight processes, instead of having extensive processes, we have fast processes. We just return very quickly to the starting point. So have a daily stand-up, reflect on what you're doing daily, try to produce software every 2 weeks. All of these things suggest doing significantly less process, right? So when the Agile Manifesto is written, it could easily take a year to build a piece of software. 6 months of that might be creating design documents, UML specifications. 6 months of building, so you don't actually show anything to a customer for a year, and then it would take you another year to fix it. So this is a problem for people in Agile. So the second piece would be working software as the repository of knowledge. So as opposed to lots of documentation, the knowledge is held in the actual software itself. Yes, it's the object that holds the knowledge. And this, in particular, has a couple implications. One is that a heavy focus on a concept that we like to call perishable knowledge. So this idea that when you start developing knowledge, it rots. It doesn't stay around. And if you believe that knowledge is a social activity, you believe kind of that as soon as that social fabric starts to fade away, so does the knowledge. So what you want to do is delay the development of knowledge as long as possible, right? So what you want to do in Agile is create what we call user stories, which are very literally like stubs of ideas. And then maybe a user story map, which would be linking these stubs of ideas together into a coherent narrative. But since you can't develop the whole narrative at once, and you can only develop it a piece at a time, you'd pull just one story down, develop the knowledge, and then develop the software coming out of that knowledge immediately before it rots. Yes? That's maybe working software as the store of knowledge and perishable knowledge. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. So instead of focusing on contracts and coming to a documented agreement on exactly what you will produce, requirements, all these types of things, a significant focus on interactive planning. So repeatedly planning as frequently as possible. Many teams will do planning every 2 weeks. And maybe do more extensive roadmap planning every 3 months. The customer becomes the judge of quality. So in particular, when you're collaborating with customers in Agile, understanding what quality is always defined by the customer. And then this all leads to a lot of what we would call deferred commitments, right? So the idea that you don't want to promise the customer anything until you've actually built it and showed it to them. That's the promise, that's the commitment, is once you've actually built the thing. Finally, and most significantly probably, a significant attempt to embrace the idea that change is endemic to software. The reason it's not hardware, the reason it is software, is because it changes constantly, and therefore you need to build the software and the processes and the knowledge around the software in a way that is built to accept that fact, built to accept change. A lot of talk these days around pivoting, so how much change and what quality of change do you have? But those would be the 4 basic ones, I think. Yes?
In theory.
In theory, yes.
In theory. Design.
So design thinking, this is an interesting thing because in a lot of ways design thinking has emerged over the last 15 years and become a lot more popular really in the last 10 years with a lot of rather vapid articles that have been published in trashy things like Forbes and Inc., which is fine. I mean, the proletariat have to read too. But one of the key things is that design thinking really stands in stark contrast in a lot of ways to Agile, because in some ways it's a very, very linear step process. It's a very waterfall process. Even the codification of it by some people like at IDEO, which have really tried to both capitalize and extract enormous rents off the selling of design thinking. It starts with this notion of go into the context where a problem arises, empathize with the customers that actually have that problem by experiencing it with them, then defining the nature of the problem that you want to solve. So within any topology, there would be n number of possible problems, but not all are worth solving, right? Some are more worth solving than others. Some are very painful for the customer. Some they're simply not willing to pay money for. And at the end of the day, we're capitalists, right? So define the nature of the problem that you wanted to solve, and then go through an abductive ideation, which epistemologically is very different from some of the traditional KM practices, because it's exploring the what-ifs. So abduction, this notion of generating many possible futures that could potentially solve for a problem is the next step in the thing, and then through some kind of rational process, analytical, whatever, testing various prototypes with real customers and getting tight feedback loops, codifying that into some kind of a schema, probably design documents, and then that's where really design thinking ends. And one of the biggest complaints is that this is then all wrapped up, put into requirements and design documents, shipped over to the client where they build about 50% of it. They have lost most of the context, most of the empathy, most of the reason for solving that problem. And so they try to build it to the best that they can, and then they ship this to the unsuspecting customer, and usually the feedback comes in the form of failure demand to your help desk. Or maybe it comes in the form of a value demand in terms of more calls to your salespeople, but really that's kind of what the design thinking process is about. What's interesting is that it really does focus on a lot of methods, practices, tools, as opposed to human interactions, even though there is a decent amount of human interaction that goes on between the customers and the design thinkers before they hand it off to the developers. But the interesting thing is the way of coming to knowing by designers is fundamentally different than a lot of other ways in which people come to knowing. So it really is this, what Dave would say some years ago is different ontologies require different epistemologies, and design thinkers have a different way of coming to knowing. It's embodied, it's instantiated, it's contingent. It's not objective, outside, analytic, intellectual. It's not something that can be codified, stuck into SharePoint where it's eventually lost and nobody sees it again, right? It's something that, what Jay was saying, right, it's ephemeral. It comes through the process of doing, this notion of reflection and action that Donald Schoen talks about, as well as Chris Argyris, but they talk about this notion that as the designer works through the problem, they externalize it through sketches, they reflect upon it, they learn in this process, and eventually they come to some relationship. So there's a conversation between the object and the designer, but also a conversation between the object and the customer, and so you have almost this triadic relationship going on, a lot of which is very difficult to codify. I don't know if Dave would agree or disagree with that statement, but I think it's this, you throw that kind of experiential knowledge away unless it's somehow documented, which tends not to happen very often. We tend to be really, really difficult. If you believe in the fallacy of the dichotomous relationship between explicit and tacit knowledge, and you accept that to be true, it's very difficult to take a lot of the embodied tacit knowledge of a designer and make it explicit and externalize it, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I think like Schoen in particular would talk about the situation talking back, right? And you can imagine engaging in a conversation. If you knew what the conversation was going to be beforehand, you wouldn't bother to have it. So there's
Unless
this,
you really enjoy hearing yourself speak.
right, which occasionally you do. But I think so. There's this idea that the actual work is a conversation with the work and the situation, and that somehow the situation will inform the decisions, and it can't be pre-scripted. It can't be pre-thought.
Right, right.
It's not a production process.
Yeah.
Okay, they're both well within time, which is going to set me a difficult task. Complexity theory is a scientific paradigm known as complex adaptive systems theory. I think I was the first to introduce it to knowledge management almost over a decade ago in an article, Complex Acts of Knowing, which is currently one of the 5th most cited articles in knowledge management. And it's not because it's the best article I or anybody else has written, but it's about the only one which deals with complexity. So that's how it gets in there. It comes in really about 40 or 50 years ago. It's known as the science of uncertainty. It's a science which deals with systems which can only be known in the present, in which the future is inherently unpredictable. So whereas in an ordered system you can predict the future based on the past, In a complex system, the same thing will never happen again the same way twice, except by accident, yeah? Which has major implications for a large part of knowledge management, because it basically says things like best practice are exactly the wrong thing to do, because it basically overstructures the approach and it lacks the ability to very dynamically and quickly adjust. Yeah? You'll find examples of it in nature. So, for example, birds fly around in the sky based on 3 simple rules: fly to the center of the flock, match speed, avoid collision. If you create another rule about leadership swapping at a time interval, you get the V shape that geese form in the sky. Oh, and if you didn't know it, Italian drivers south of Naples have been studied. They actually drive on exactly the same principle as birds flock, all right? But the original stuff on what we now call computational complexity really focuses on the idea if you understand simple rules, you can predict system behavior through modeling. Yeah? So, for example, the whole complexity of a termite's nest is chemically encoded triggers to genetically encoded rules. Yeah? And you start to see this as people build large-scale models. Now, several of us, over a decade or so ago, started to explain to academics that human beings aren't ants. This seems to me fairly self-evident, but it's very difficult for people whose entire academic career is based on human beings being like ants, otherwise their models won't work. Right? For what we call the 3 I's of cognitive complexity. So human beings have different identities. Yeah, they flex between identity based on context. So how you focus changes very rapidly. In fact, you're very different people in different contexts. It's part of, I was satirizing this yesterday, the nonsense of things like Myers-Briggs, which has no basis whatsoever in any science at all. And it's just, you know, it's the equivalent of astrology, only without the historical precedents that make it more accurate. The reality is human beings just move between different identities based on context and radically change how they behave based on that. They're not pre-given. Yeah? The second one is intelligence. We actually have the ability to comprehend our world, not respond to it. We're the only species to show altruism outside a kinship group, for example, and that radically modifies the thing. And finally, we have the whole concept of identity, intelligence, and I've forgotten this, intentionality. That we do things intentionally, we don't just do things because the system tells us to do them. Right? So that means human systems are inherently complex. And the key thing to understand about a complex adaptive system is you manage in the present, you can't manage to a future. Yet the future is unknowable because there aren't enough examples in the past to allow you to make accurate predictions about the future. So it becomes far more important to describe the present and then operate within the present. Now, the first real take-up of this was actually in counterterrorism before and after 9/11, because if you're trying to study the preconditions which lead to radicalization, you're dealing with systems which are inherently unpredictable. Yeah, you can't actually predict a terrorist outrage, but you can give an indication that the plausibility or the dispositions of the system are such that terrorism is more likely, therefore you should pay attention as a human being. Now, to give an illustration of the practical application of this, we've taken the work we did for DARPA on that. We're now doing it to actually trigger alerts for social workers where the dispositional state of narrative indicates that a child is more likely to be abused and therefore they should stay in a house and ask more questions. We're not saying we can predict that a child will be abused, but we can actually say the dispositional state is such that the plausibility is high enough that you should pay more attention. Yeah? And this is giving rise to a whole new body of practice called anticipatory awareness, which is one of the things I'm flying to Italy on tonight, which is actually how do you trigger human beings to a heightened state of alert when they need to look at what's going on in a different way. And that's kind of like managing the present. Right? I think it's also useful to contrast it with what happened with the last major movement, which was systems thinking. And please don't confuse systems thinking with complexity thinking. Yeah, they're radically different. What happens in the 1980s is we get 3 things come together. One is we get a recession. Recessions are really good for new ideas. Yeah, we had the same back in the 1920s with scientific management, right? Without a recession, very few things change because the system's too stable. You get a radical new communication technology. It's not until the 80s computers can scale information processing. Yeah, until the 1980s, things had to be organized in silos because human beings were managing the information flow. So everything is organized by silos. What happens is then we get the growth of scalable computing, PCs, mini computing, all those sort of things. And all of a sudden, we can manage huge information volumes. So we get business process re-engineering, which is the first popular manifestation of systems thinking, which says you can organize horizontally across the organization. You no longer need to organize vertically in silos. Yeah? So we get the hard end, hammer and chamfery business process re-engineering, with an appalling phrase at the front of the book: nothing which has ever happened in the past has any relevance to the future. But that was the engineering culture of the 1980s. You had zero-based budgeting. The assumption was you could engineer anything. That's the metaphor.
Yep.
So everything in architectural terms is a greenfield site.
Yep.
And then at what I call the new age fluffy bunny end of systems thinking, you have Peter Senge and more later Otto Scharmerger, who basically talk about how life would be wonderful if only everybody was perfect, and therefore can spend their entire lives talking about everybody should be perfect and avoid any engagement whatsoever in reality. And I'm sorry to be cynical about that, but I get deeply disturbed about those sort of moves because it allows a high level of self-indulgence. But what you see in systems thinking is this fundamental concept that you can define a future state and close the gap and achieve it. And if you look what happens in the 80s, it's the first time we get 3-year plans and 5-year plans. We get key performance indicators. We get outcome-based targets. We get a whole series of things because the engineering metaphor of linear causality is dominating the way that people think, and therefore everything has to achieve a preset of goals. Now, just to give you the science on this, all the available scientific evidence, and give you the reference in New Scientist if you want, shows that where people are working for explicit, measurable goals, it destroys intrinsic motivation. Yeah? The evidence is that without exception. And you can see it in education, where teachers who inspire kids to learn don't get promoted. But teachers who fill out a learning plan and complete the learning plan, what they've done is they've taken this highly explicit, measurable route, regardless of the consequences. Yeah? So kind of like that dominates from the 1980s, and that's when knowledge management came along. The Narka is a classic systems thinker. Yeah, tacit knowledge, remember the phrase, it walks out of the door every night? Therefore, we have to build computer systems to store information. Nobody said, hang on a minute, why don't we just try and stop the employees, make sure they come back every day, all right? That might have been a lot simpler and a lot cheaper, all right? But remember, one of the reasons Myers-Briggs is popular is it allows human beings to be treated as widgets on a factory shelf. Yep. It's no coincidence it took off at that time, because the concept is people are units in a manufacturing process, and I'll come back to that when we come on to design thinking in a minute. Sure. So complexity theory says we manage the present, we describe the present, we make small changes. We're now working on what are called vector measures, by which you measure direction and speed of travel. Because if you measure, are we going in the right direction at the right speed, you've got far more capability to adjust as the circumstances change. The other thing, this is Alicia Geraro's point, meaning exists in the gaps between things, not in the things themselves. More knowledge is created in social interaction than it can ever be codified in a database. Yep. Yeah, Larry Prusak, who I used to work with, famously said, if you have $1 to invest in knowledge management, put 1 cent into information management and 99 cents into connecting people. And by the way, connecting people is not building an information management system called a community of practice. Yeah, that's just trying to get away from the problem that actually human dynamics and human interactions actually matter. Yeah? So complexity is giving us a radical new approach to look at that. It's giving us new tools and techniques. And probably one of the key aspects of this is what we call the human sensor network. So I'll finish off with one actual example of the work we're doing. This is kind of like a flagship project for the new centre. We're creating a citizen journalist program that we've already run in Pakistan, in Libya, in Colombia, in the UK, in Mexico, in which children will go into their communities every month to gather stories from those communities about what's working or not working. Yeah? Interpreted by the people who tell the stories, not by a computer algorithm and not by an expert. And the transfer of the power of interpretation is a key aspect. That will create an open source database which effectively replaces market research, because the people are interpreting their own situation in a way that can be read or accessed by people in power. Yeah? And that's also designed to counter the tyranny of things like social computing, because these days social computing is all about who can create the most tweets, not who actually represents a group of people. So one of the key aspects, and I'm going to leave you with this thought, complexity is about real-time feedback from a distributed network of human sensors. You need a huge amount of human sensors, all of your employees, all of your citizens, giving continuous feedback in real time. So you see small opportunities to achieve positive change, and then you put a small amount of resource in to nudge things in the right direction. And you move fundamentally to an ecological model of change, not an engineering model of change. So that's kind of like 101 complexity. Right? Yep. Now, one of the things I wanted to introduce in this discussion about it is one of the things I've noticed with Agile and also with design thinking is what started off as an artisan process, and I've seen the same in knowledge management. It started off as, knowledge management was about 4 or 5 years apprenticeships. Yeah, you had to do the job, you had to get the different experience. Design thinking was an apprenticeship, 10 plus years before you could do any work.
Yeah, inside design studio.
Yeah, all of that sort of stuff inside design studio. What then happened, and it was part of the systems thinking engineering metaphor, is these things have to be reduced to linear structured processes where the revenue now comes from training people to follow recipes rather than executing. Right?
Training and offering up certifications.
Got it. Okay, so guys, over to you on that one.
Yeah. I think, a couple things. One, I think, when we see kind of the fad movements in management, we get not only demand for training, but demand for resources who we can say are agile, right? So there's actually, people are being rewarded at work for having agile teams and having enough people and enough people certified. So it's both sides of that, I think, happen. I think in general, there's a couple things that ends up happening when we move away from kind of the craft-based, and it's really craft. It's not just expert, right? It's people who have been embedded in the practice and doing the practice for long periods of time. First, we get just a large amount of expert bias. So, the people who came up with the Agile Manifesto just don't understand when they meet someone who doesn't get Agile. They don't understand. What do I need to explain to you? They forget that they did the work for 10 years, and that's why they know how to do the work. They just think that that they've discovered something they just hand off to other people, and I think that's...
And part of that, and the other part is that they can just install.
That's right.
Like in the Matrix, I know Kung Fu, right? They can just install the Agile mindset into their employees.
Yeah, and I just, in my experience, we haven't seen that work anywhere. It is an extended period of time. Grappling with uncertainty, accepting a certain amount of ambiguity in your work are not comfortable experiences for most people. They just need to learn how to actually act in that system.
It's actually quite interesting because I've been tracking the Agile movement since I first spoke at an XP conference 10 years ago. And it's tracking KM by about a 10-year lag.
Yeah.
So it starts off as a huge fashion. There are hundreds of conferences. I remember one day in London, I keynoted at 6 different KM conferences. In one day. Right? And that was not unusual. And a similar thing is happening in Agile at the moment, right? What then happened is it started to lose its fad status. But then we got the certifiers. I remember Patrick Lamb, who's here somewhere, I think, wrote a famous paper called The Autism of KM, which was an attack on anybody who tried to certify KM. And I remember there were 3 rival groups trying to control certification. And all of them were reducing KM to things that could be put into documents and trained by inexperienced trainers, and people be given certificates. And their excuse for this was never to justify the content, but to say people need certificates, otherwise they can't get jobs.
That's right.
And now we're seeing the same in Agile.
Absolutely.
There's more money made in Agile through training revenue than there is by writing good code. So it's almost like there's this cycle, which is actually quite dangerous, which things go through. And again, my view is that's linked to this concept of linear causality, which came in the 80s. That everything has to be engineered. You can't just let things be. right? You constantly got to interfere.
And you
Yep.
see some manifestations in this desire of control, and not to say
Yeah.
that all top-down taxonomies are bad, but in the desire to be able to create a strong top-down taxonomy in certain situations where we're seeing in large enterprises, some of the clients that Jabe and I deal with, where they have, their primary business for a lot of global operating companies is really in the buying of future cash flows from smaller companies, and then, figuring out what to do with it, somehow retiring all the technical debt that they acquire, and getting rid of all the bad seeds since they can't install their culture into the new company. And I noticed that with Activision buying King Games, it's like wondering which culture is going to win out over that. But the interesting thing is how this kind of creates a very strange, sometimes negative spiral.
I think that, and there's two things that I'd added to this part of the discussion. One is, go to a lot of organizations, they say, well, how are we going to get everybody to do Agile? And my first question is, well, why would you want everybody to do Agile? Like, it's not, you don't have to have every team using this methodology. There's a lot of different methodologies that are appropriate in different ways. You should probably retain some of your experts in traditional project management, because I assure you will have deterministic projects that need to be run that way. But the second piece that I think is really important at least when we look at kind of the negative aspects of Agile, is kind of this, their notion of empirical almost goes back to one of the original meanings of empirical, as in quackish, right? Like, literally, they don't know why it works, and they don't care why it works. They just think it works. The result of this is that you get, people who just think that they can install stuff randomly around the business. They don't have a lot of theory behind it. They don't understand what the ideas are, how it is that the Agile works. And this causes a lot of issues as well, I think.
Right. But there are some positive sides to Agile as well. Sorry about that.
I'll come back to the positive bit in a minute. We're on a negative hype here. One of the big problems here is you've got the total misappropriation and abuse of scientific method in management science. So scientific method says you study empirical phenomena, from that you derive hypotheses.
That's right.
Then you see if the hypothesis repeats in future practice.
Yep.
Well, management science doesn't do that.
Nope.
It's a phenomenon which is called Gladwellism by a good friend of mine. Right? He
Yep.
writes for the Sunday Times. I've forgotten the exact definition, but Gladwellism is a sensationalization of a partially understood idea through the selection of cases in a sensational environment, right?
Yep.
And don't ever tell any cognitive neuroscientist that you've taken Blink seriously, because they won't invite you around for dinner ever again in your life, right? But what you've actually got is people now want to write a sensational book on a 3-year cycle, because that will up their speaker fee. Yeah, and then there's a consultancy business built around it. And the key thing is that you have one single idea that everybody thinks is now the latest buzzy thing.
Yep.
Now, you can get the respectable end of this. So somebody like Taleb, who I have a huge amount of time for, who
Yep.
never writes bad stuff.
Yep.
But anti-fragility is just a subset of resilience. So he's damaging the understanding of resilience by trying to create something unique.
Yep.
But the pressure is to create something unique to deal with it. Then you get the weak end of it. So there's this, anybody come across spiral dynamics? Okay, it's one of these heavyweight cults. It's associated with people like Ken Wilber, at which point, if people take Wilber seriously, you know the world is about in its end days, all right? So the idea is there are different colors, and you ascend through different levels of civilization. Yeah, and it used to finish with turquoise, but now it's gone up to jade, because too many people have achieved turquoise status. So the inventors have to go up to a higher stage of enlightenment, all right? I remember at one conference with Beck, all right? I mean, it's hysterical. He told me I couldn't understand what he was talking about, because he'd reached turquoise level and I was only a blue. So I had badges made, proud to be brown, and then they told me I didn't understand spiral dynamics because brown wasn't a color. And I realized there was no point in being subtle in the way you handled it, right? But we've just had a book published, right, which is going the rounds, which is selling a huge amount.
Yep.
It's somebody who's got a belief in holacracy, which has no valid real basis at all.
Yep.
But he's selected aspects of cases which justify the book, and you've got the cases, but you haven't got repetition. Yeah, so it's actually saying, I will find things in the past which support my theory.
Yep.
I'll publish a best-selling book on that, and then that will become a popular movement.
Yep.
And to be honest, an awful lot of KM books do the same thing. They describe things that people did, and then actually prescribe them as methods, rather than saying, I think this is where we're definitely coming from on complexity.
Yep.
If you can't find a reason in the natural science why something works, you shouldn't replicate it.
Yep.
Yeah, and they famously said at an Agile conference, if you don't know why you shouldn't replicate a how.
Yep.
And I think that's one of the problems. You've got this very simplistic approach.
And just no way of weeding practices either. Like,
Yeah.
well, this thing I did work here, so I should just breed that practice all over the place. No understanding of how would I know when to stop using it? How would I know where to use it appropriately? Any of that type of stuff.
It's a visibility thing as well, but it was interesting in KM. One of the things we proved in IBM, it's in the article I mentioned, there were 64 informal communities for every formal community of practice.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a 64 to 1 ratio. And actually what was interesting is the huge number of things. IBM didn't then own Lotus, so they took Lotus Notes and they made a thing called Workroom, which kind of like fell over and wasn't consistent, and Lotus hated it. But it didn't matter because you used it with a small group of people and you all knew how to make it work. Now what was interesting is the reaction when I wrote that paper in IBM was not, oh, this is interesting, how do we make more tools available? It was, we need to get those 64 and decide which ones are formal communities and kill the others.
Yep.
Because they couldn't get the concept that informal networks have high trust in them,
Yeah.
whereas formal systems can never have trust, because you can't control the membership or you can't control access to the data. So it's this explicit type approach.
Yep.
And design thinking, I think, is doing the same.
Yeah, in design thinking is not proliferating the way that Agile had or KM did, but through another name, which probably a lot of people in this room are familiar with, user experience design has proliferated over the last 10 to 15 years. Number of conferences, number of people that are sticking that on their job title, number of people that are, same thing as in KM, number of people that are calling for the codification of what is our body of knowledge, what are our formal practices, how do you get certified in user experience design, and of course there's the other side to the exact same argument that's saying that it's an emergent practice. There are good practices, there are novel practices, there are no best practices in user experience design, and we shouldn't codify it to begin with because then it will die like everything else. But it's it is a fundamental problem that UX designers, design thinkers have is this notion of legitimacy, and how do you know that this other person is a designer?
Yeah.
Like, and what is the nature of your knowingness? Is it justified, right? In believing this, and it's moved away from scanning LinkedIn profiles and stuff like that, and bringing people up. One of the practices that more and more companies have been doing over the last 5 to 10 years is just bring people in and have them pair with you for a couple of days or 6 or 7 hours, and just collaboratively solve a problem together, because only in that way can you understand how they kind of scan potential problems and how they address them and how they frame them.
The best practice thing is interesting because, I mean, best practice was one of the foundations for knowledge management. The idea is you should share it. If you actually check on the science of it, is people actually don't share stories of success. They share stories of failure.
Yeah.
The principal mechanism for knowledge transfer, which evolved in human beings, is fragmented water cooler stories of failure.
Yep.
We've just been doing a huge amount of work on health and safety, which is one of the big areas for complexity-based approaches. Yeah? What we're finding is the stories people share which have value, which people remember and which they learn from, aren't stories about how I clipped on and was secure and I lived, but they're stories about how I didn't clip on, I fell on my back and I'm bloody lucky to be alive.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually the stories of failure which spread fastest and provide the most learning within an organization. Now, it turns out, when you check into this, that actually the human brain imprints success. It doesn't imprint success. It takes a time lag, and it often doesn't do it. But failure, it recognizes instantly.
Yep.
And
You don't want to be eaten by
well,
tigers,
right. Yeah, avoidance of failure is actually a more successful evolutionary strategy than imitation of success.
Yep.
Now, that was one of the things which drove me into narrative databases, because actually, if you build a narrative database, you've got a worst practice system, which has high utility. Whereas a best practice system is just a game that people play.
Yep.
And we're finding now that conformity with best practice is making people less safe, because all the best practices create so many rules and so many constraints
Yep.
that the only way to get the job done is to break the rules. So rule breaking becomes habitual, so you become more at risk.
Yep.
It's not exceptional, which means you would pay attention.
Yep. I think there's also, like, especially inside design thinking, because designers have this kind of abductive logic and abductive rationality, when you come and you place a best practice on top of that, people seem to be, you're asked to act literally irrationally according to your concept of rationality. You're asked to act in a way that doesn't make any sense to you. So you kind of act relatively randomly, you don't know exactly what you're doing, and then the facilitator of the best practice looks at it and goes, these people don't know what they're doing. They're acting like they're crazy. And then they assume that the people, don't understand. It's not the process that's broken, it's the people that's broken. You get all sorts of kind of negative behaviors out of that.
It kind of like fits, I think one of the things you've seen in all the engineering approaches is
Yep.
they manage to the center of a normal distribution.
That's right, yep.
So one of the big things you saw at the beginning of systems thinking is the growth of ERP systems like SAP. And then Lotus Notes was the same in knowledge management, which got replaced by SharePoint.
Yep.
Yeah? But the concept is that what you will do is you will, and I remember it being said at the time, is we shouldn't have everybody doing their own thing. Everybody should conform to one standard, because then the world would be a better place.
Yep.
And that's okay if you can define the standard. Yeah? The trouble is, these days, you're managing in the tails of distributions,
Yep.
and they're not normal distributions anymore. They're Pareto distributions, so the tails are bloody fat.
That's right, yep.
And you've got systems designed for the center of a normal distribution, and you can't change them.
Yep.
Because at the moment, the investment to put in a big ERP system, it's like a 3 or 4 year process. And the change process is 2 or 3 years, so the system is unresponsive. And the same is true, you use something like SharePoint to manage information. Everybody should have an information management system. But you need something much more fragmented and much more unstructured to manage dynamic, rapid change.
Yep.
Yeah, things need to move in and out actually very quickly in terms of the way it works.
Yep.
And we'll talk a bit about that on the
One
future.
of the things we've seen recently, and Jabe and I are experimenting with this as well, and with a lot of our teams, we believe, and this more comes out of the lean thinking movement, not Lean Six Sigma, which is a totally different beast. But from the lean thinking movement, which is the notion of visual management systems, so externalizing your work, being able to create a shared understanding of what work is flowing through your system, and that combined with a very lightweight communication tool like Slack, which is what we have, and so there's this notion of teams get together in a practice of daily looking at what is the work that we're currently doing, what are the blockers, do we need any help, is there any fixed date stuff, and as stuff dynamically moves through the system, it alerts and then causes conversations to happen within Slack, but they're contextual. They're in a place and time.
We're doing the same with what are called fitness landscapes. So we're taking huge knowledge databases of 200 or 500, 600,000 items,
Yep.
effectively represented as three-dimensional landscapes in which the contour lines come together where you've got density, but you've got outlier events. So your eye focuses on dominant patterns and outliers, and you find things you didn't expect to find. In fact, I'm now arguing that knowledge management should really retitle itself serendipity management. Because managing for serendipity actually has more utility.
Yeah, right.
Either way, we're coming towards the end, so...
To your point, what you were just saying about normal distribution, sometimes the most interesting
Are in the
places
tails.
for exploitation, or at least potential new innovative places, is in the outliers, right?
Okay, guys, so we got 10 minutes, so you've got 3 minutes each.
Yep.
Yeah. Look, where's the future? Because all of these things are coming together, kind of together. What's kind of the future? What would you get people to focus on? Or what are you doing?
So I think specifically for knowledge management, I think we need to flatten ontologies significantly, by which I mean humans, objects, systems all kind of need to be treated as co-equal agents in a system. They all need to be seen as co-equal. I think that's really important. I think we need to start rethinking the dichotomy generally in software engineering is experts versus generalists, and I think we really need to think differently about that. In particular, I think we probably need to think about kind of what you would call crew roles, the difference, experts in a context as opposed to just an expert. Generalization, kind of de-skilling, is not a useful activity, but we need to rethink the way that we're kind of working on that. And in general, I would say, a lot of the things that are happening in Agile tend to be an overemphasis on reification in order to get that to that empirical thing. So we need to focus on dynamics. We need to focus on products as evolving processes and not as something that is done. And finally, we really need to, if we're going to think about knowledge management inside of these kind of processes, I think we need to really focus on heuristics and understanding that it's not just the information that's coming through, it's how the decisions are made with that information. And changing that type of behavior is going to be really critical.
There was the thing that, Dave, you mentioned a little bit earlier, and I think it's important because it ties a little bit in with both design thinking and Agile when you're talking about the idea of dispositionality, right? And dispositionality within a system, and it reminds me of a couple of talks that I've heard, and one that I gave most recently in Scotland about Pierre Bourdieu's notion of dispositions within a habitus, or habitus being the word that he chose for practice. And one of the things, if you break down Agile or design thinking, they have rituals and practices that are where the knowledge is embodied, right? So within Agile, you have certain things that are immutable. You have sprint planning, you have a daily stand-up, you have a demo day where you display, hey, this is the problem we were solving, this is where we are, this is what we're doing, this is what we learned. And then you have retrospective, so it's this notion of inspect and adapt. So you're inspecting what happened with both the product and what happened with the process, and how do we find small incremental places for improvement. So the team gathers around and they're able to share these experiences, and it's relatively codified. You won't find very many Agile or Scrum teams that don't have these practices, and designers have the exact same thing where they have some amount of talking to the customer, interviewing the customer journaling, observation, talk out loud. They have creating massive walls of Post-it notes and affinity diagramming, creating kind of like bottoms-up card sorting. So very similar in some ways to information science, where you have bottom-up card sorting. And then some notion of synthesis, of coalescing of key insights. And then the abduction phase, so generating a lot of potential sketches to a problem. And these things are embodied practice that requires dispositionality based on what are you trying to do and what is your context. And it's these things are where interesting stuff is happening, and it's a question of what are the core practices that people involved in CAM do, and how does that manifest itself, and how is information shared? Another thing is in XP you have this notion of pairing, which is very popular and it's not just for code quality, although that is important. A more important thing is actually culture and knowledge transfer that happens. And one of the things, and this was studied, is that when you have a cluster of potential things that can be done, and the team decides, hey, we're going to work on this next item first, who should work on it? And most people would probably say, hey, we're going to pick the person strongest at working on that particular work item to work on it. What they found in the studies is actually you want to pick the least skillful person and pair them with somebody a little bit more knowledgeable. Yep. And that tends to actually, if you believe in the value of velocity measurement in Agile teams, that actually increases the velocity of value delivery to the customer. Yep. is this pairing thing, right?
Yep. There's an interesting aspect on that pair, and I mentioned this yesterday at the workshop. We know that people under 25 and over 45 are innovative, and people between 25 and 45 aren't. Sorry about that, guys. Right? Because actually in evolutionary terms, after you reach past puberty, you get to the point where you have to go and hunt for the tribe. So the models that you've established about the way you see the world actually don't change until you can no longer hunt for the tribe and you have to go and look after the kids. So it's a chemically triggered form of plasticity. What we're finding is actually teaming young people with older people is more successful than teaming older people with their successors. It's called the grandparent syndrome. Grandparents will tell things to their grandchildren that they won't tell to their children. Because it's a different type of rivalry. It's more of a sort of coach and educational role. And there's some other interesting things. This comes out of the anthropology side of it, all right? That the skip generation combination is more effective than the together generations, which actually gives us a whole new way of managing the aging workforce, in terms of mentoring, right? Mm-hmm. We also know that ritual changes the way that people see the world. So we've made radical changes in safety simply by getting people to dress differently before they go into a different job. We're now taking that to take software coders and getting them to dress differently when they go to test the code. Because in cognitive science terms, if you change the way you dress, it changes the cognitive activation pattern of the brain, so you see things differently. Mm-hmm. But it takes that sort of physical act to actually make the change. And again, that's the sort of science-based type approach on this. I think there's a couple of other things, big things coming through. The dispositional state is key. Yep. It's quite interesting. The Obama White House has just adopted nudge economics, which is disastrous. But it's kind of like fashion items. So the idea is you don't have big economic programs, you nudge people. The trouble is it isn't a nudge, it's a yank. So kind of like, what do the policymakers want? How can we pull people together in little tugs? Yeah? Now, some of the work we're doing now at the university with the Welsh Centre for Behavioural Change is what's the dispositions of a population measured through their day-to-day stories.
Yep.
When a dispositional state emerges, we see it on the landscape maps, and then we can nudge it in the right direction. But we don't invest any money in change until the system is disposed to change.
Yep.
Which means, for example, if you want to do a knowledge culture, which is a lot of my work at the moment, is how do you create a knowledge-sharing culture? You actually can't afford to run top-down programs on how things should be, because people have been doing that for 3 decades, and people have got very cynical. The minute you announce a corporate change initiative, it's dead, simply because of people's previous experience. So what you do is you continuously map, the day-to-day narratives. Yeah? You then try and actually introduce small changes. We call it more like this, fewer like that. So you say to executives, what can you do tomorrow to create more stories like this and fewer stories like that? Not how would you create a culture of knowledge sharing, which is too abstract. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Then when the system starts to be disposed in a more favourable direction, then you push the investment in. Yep. Yeah? Now that's actually a huge difference in economics, but it's also a new theory of change within the firm, is you have to first of all manage or even manipulate the dispositional state.
Yep.
And anybody with teenagers knows how to do this, right? You have to create a dispositional state which allows you to do an intervention. If you do the intervention without first thinking about the dispositional state, it's wrong. And it comes back to that fundamental point. You're managing the present, not an idealistic future state. That's probably the big difference people have got to get to.
Yep.
Because the minute you define a future state, you miss the opportunities which you haven't seen in the present.
Yep.
Yeah? And that's kind of like mapping those is key. And that is the sort of final conclusion I'd make. I mean, remember, what we human beings are currently capable of knowing is about what we can write down of that is about 5%.
Yep.
Yeah? Oh, and just to scare you, if you take handwritten notes, you absorb more than if you type. Right? Because the abstract process works in a very different way. Right? So we're starting to learn that techno-fetishism is actually quite dangerous, and a focus on text is actually very, very limited. Yeah? So I think one of the things where I get excited about in the Internet of Things is we're talking about sensors, not just physical sensors like this beautiful Apple Watch, which I've fallen in love with and I've become obsessed with. All right?
Friends don't let friends buy Apple Watches.
I was left alone in the Apple store, right? But the point is, we're now increasing the number of sensors around, but also the key thing, which is certainly my focus, is how do you create human sensors in the same network as the physical sensors?
Yep.
Because what matters is not content, but flow.
Yep.
We're moving into a world where you can't afford for anything to be static. Everything has got to be constantly changing. So sharing metadata is more important than sharing data, because you don't know what data you need until you need it, then you want something different. Yep. Yeah, so linking and connecting people, creating sensor networks, visualization. I think we'll actually sooner or later see that data analytics is a hugely valuable thing. Buy one, use it, it's useful.
Yep.
But it's probably about 5 or 10% of what you need to do on knowledge management. Yep. What you really need to focus on is human and machine-based sensor nets with real-time feedback loop and the ability to do very rapid intervention to shift things in the right direction.
Yep.
Okay, thanks guys. Experiment. I hope it was useful. Hand back to you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.